Hello everyone, I hope you're well. If you're locked in like we are here in Hawaii, let's do something fun and creative together. How about we paint something loose and fresh in watercolor? In this video, I'll show you step by step how to paint what I call loose realism. I'm Delro Rosco, an artist and illustrator from Hawaii. Let's paint. Aloha everyone. Let's get started with a supply list of what we'll need. Some watercolor paper, which comes in pads or blocks, and sheets in a variety of surface textures from smooth to rough. A pencil of any kind will do. An eraser. I like this kneaded type. It's great for dabbing and lightening your drawing, but any type of eraser will be just fine. A medium-sized round watercolor brush. Whatever kind of tape you have available. Watercolors, they come in tubes or pans. Your color selection will depend on what subject matter you select. A palette to hold the watercolors, something like these, but don't worry if you don't have this. A flat dish of any kind will be just fine. You can tape the watercolor paper in the corners just like this, or all the way around like this. You also need a container of water and paper towels. Here are some examples of some watercolors that were done loosely yet realistically. They were created for an illustration project. And here is how the art was used on the final product label. What I'm doing here is removing the top sheet from my watercolor paper pad. I've inserted a palette knife, you can use a letter opener, and I'm running it across the edges all the way around. Until you can remove the top sheet. And there we have a fresh new sheet ready to paint on. I'm using reference photos to paint from, but if you have subject matter around the house that you like, it's always best to paint from life. I'm beginning to lightly sketch out the placement of my apple on the paper. I'm drawing very lightly, just to indicate the general shape. And one thing good about drawing something from nature, it's okay if you're a little off here and there. No one will ever be able to tell. Just have fun with it. So I'm drawing just light lines indicating where the top of the apple is, where my highlight on the apple is going to be, where my stem is going to come out from, and refining the outside silhouette or shape of my apple. I'm taking some liberties here to add on a leaf just to create interest. Now I'm using my eraser to lighten the drawing before painting. Here I'm adding some watercolor to my palette. Remember, a little goes a long way. I'm loading my brush with water and then adding some of that water with the brush to my watercolor, mixing it well. I'll get more water and mix up some dry watercolor. So I'm loading my brush with watercolor and starting with the lightest color in the lightest areas of my painting. With watercolors, you want to work from light to dark. So I'm adding some orange here, letting the colors blend together, wiping off old paint and loading up clean yellow again. And I'm just trying to loosely indicate areas of yellow that I want to appear on this apple. So as you can see, I'm not really concerned with detail, but more adding general color here and there of where I see yellow or would want yellow to go. I'm not trying to add yellow to the whole form. I'm keeping some areas of the white paper open, just to have a variety of shades of yellow. Being careful as I come around the edges. Now I'm starting to add shades of orange here and there, just to build up the form. Now I'm just using clean water to pull pigment here and there. I'm trying to drag some of the pigment off to the edges and being careful not to put any paint in the area where the stem is going to go. As you can see, I always clean my brush in between changing colors. Here I'm trying to get some reds going. And while the paper is still damp, I'm just dropping in some color. And just letting the colors bleed into each other. Being careful to save my highlight area and not fill that with paint. Reaching for deeper shades of red. And notice I'm using directional strokes, almost following the curvature of the apple. Even though it's loose, some of these strokes help define the curve and shape of and form of the apple, which is what you desire. So I'm pulling deeper shades of red here and there, especially in the shadow areas, and just to help define its shape. I'm not filling the entire apple with red, but leaving areas of the yellow to show through. Again, using directional shapes to help define the top portion of the apple. I use the paper towel a lot to blot off some of the extra water on the brush. Knowing just the right amount of water to use, it's instinctual to me, but I think you'll understand it more when you actually do it. Too much water will make color bleed all over the place, and too little water will make strokes with hard edges of color. Right now I'm trying to add some really faint shades of pigment into the highlighted area. I'm softening some of the edges of the strokes just by using the brush and some water. Here I'm using a paper towel to blot off some of the paint that I applied, just to lighten my highlighted area again. This way I can control the amount of color that I want to apply to that area. Now I'm using a little more obvious strokes to kind of mimic the texture on the skin of the apple. Again, not filling up with red everywhere, but letting some of the previous layers show through, such as the yellows and the oranges. If you look at an apple in person and see the skin, you can see that there's tons of layers of color and texture. I slow my stroke down on the edges just to be more precise, and looser and faster within. Here I'm fanning the brush, almost making the hairs of the brush spray open like a rake. Sometimes I'll squeeze the brush. And this helps give finer strokes. Again, following the contour and form of the apple. So as you can see, we're slowly starting to build the apple with color. Creating interest by letting some previous layers of paint show through, such as yellow and orange. Now I'm mixing a deeper shade of red, kind of using a burgundy or maroon to add to the red of my apple, just in the shadow areas, just to give the apple form. Removing some of the paint, blotting off some of the moisture. So this is a little different shade of red from the dark that was used in the apple. Shadow area, that is. Just to get a wide variety of shades of red, it just creates interest in the painting. So as we add more and more layers of red, we start to move from what looked like more like a peach to more like an apple now. Of course, there's many types of apples out there. This one happens to be, I think, a gala apple. Again, slowing down my stroke on the edges. I'm just working on adding deeper shades of red here and there. So on the top of the apple, this is starting to give it form and definition. So the paper has dried somewhat, and that's why you can see some more obvious strokes here and there, as opposed to the beginning where everything kind of just bled into each other. So I think I'll let the apple dry just for a little bit and move on to the area of the leaf. So again, working from the lightest colors, in this case, pale shades of yellow or yellow-green, not filling in the whole space of the leaf, but just here and there. And the reason why I'm moving on to another section of the painting is that I want to define the apple a little more, and the paper has to dry a little bit in order for that to happen. So I'm being careful not, oh, here's my green palette, if you're wondering where I'm getting my green color from. So now I'm starting to pull some of that pale shades of green, mixing in with the yellow, just around here and there. I'm trying to be careful not to get the heel of my hand on the damp apple below. And I'm just lightly dragging faint shades of green here and there, again slowing down when I'm painting the edges. So right now I'm mixing some deeper shades of green, and I'm going to start applying it to the damp leaf area, and again letting some of these colors just blend in what was previously applied here and there. Again, not filling in the whole shape of the leaf, making sure to leave some of the previous layers exposed to create interest. So now I'm just using a damp brush to pull some of this color and wiping my brush in a paper towel as I go along. Just to carefully define the leaf. That's the paper towel I'm wiping some of the pigment off of. And being careful with the edges. And blending some of these colors together. So I think at this point, I'll just keep adding deeper colors here and there, just like we did with the shadow area of the apple. I'm trying to mix just the right, interesting, deep shade of green here. And again, not filling in the whole thing, but just adding darks here and there, just to create interest. Removing some of the paint. And again, pulling paint and pigment around. Being real careful where the stem of the leaf meets the apple stem. So I think I'll let the apple leaf dry and go back to my apple now. And I'm starting to add some yellow here and there. One thing about watercolor, when it dries, it usually dries lighter than it appears than when it's wet. So some of my yellow that was applied before might have been too faint for my liking at this point. So I'm just adding another layer or more layers of yellow. This area got a little too dark for me, so I just blotted some off, adding some water here. And when I lift and blot with the paper towel, some of those previous layers come off. There's some control with this, but too much blotting can muddy down your painting too. So I'm careful not to do that too much. So just trying to add some little transparent layers of yellow here and there, just to give the apple skin a little more richness. And again, blotting off areas where I felt like too much blending happened or the color of the skin went too dark. So with some of the other areas of the apple dry or wet, I'm trying to add some more layers of directional strokes of paint. Again, this just helps give the apple more form. And I'm just trying to get the right balance of loose, watery strokes with little more definable strokes. It helps the apple has a freshness, a looseness, and at the same time, some degree of realism. Again, I'm trying to pull some color into the highlight area, being careful not to fill that area in completely. Cleaning my brush in between. As I go back, I think I'm going back maybe to my leaf again. Adding different shades of green this time. Maybe areas where the sunlight hits the leaf or goes through it. And then deepening shadows to help emphasize that more. So I'm not trying to be exacting here, but I guess the best way to put it is precise and loose, and a going back and forth of that. Just trying to give the leaf a little more definition and form, and then pulling some of that paint along the edge. Making sure not to fill in or cover some of those previous lighter shades of green. Adding some faint shades of yellow where I feel like the sunlight filters through the leaves or the leaf. Just pulling some of that yellow here and there to mix with some of the green. And the same here along the stem of the leaf. And as I'm working, the watercolors are still kind of moving and drying as they blend into each other. And they kind of do their own thing. And you'll have such interesting strokes if you just let the paint do its thing. So now I'm trying to paint the stem of the apple, putting in some of the lighter gold colors of the apple stem top. And then I'll mix a deeper color, almost a burgundy brown color, for the darkest part or shadow of the stem area of the apple. It's a pretty tight area to work in. Again, just using a damp brush to help pull some of that pigment to define my stem. Still not quite satisfied with some of my dark areas of the stem, so I'm adding even a deeper color of brown or ochre or burgundy brown. to help define the darkest edge of my apple stem. At this point, I think I'll add a few more layers of a deeper red just to finish off defining my apple. So I'm adding some here to the top edge of the apple. And this is a little drier application of watercolor than what we started with. So I'm just dragging some of these strokes, again, just to create some of the interest and contours of the apple. You notice there's not too much water on my brush. I'm just adding strokes here and there. Again, not filling in the whole apple, but just picking and choosing where I want some of these relatively loose strokes to go. And the paper is still a little damp, so these strokes look hard-edged at first, but they bleed somewhat into the previous layers. And I think I'm pretty satisfied with this. So here we have it, still wet, but loose realism. If you let this dry, you can keep adding more applications of pigment and make it as tight as you want, or I could have stopped earlier and make the painting look looser. Here's an example of taking the painting further and using a drier brush technique to define form and shape. So there you have it, loose realism. Thanks for joining me, folks. I hope this time together creating something beautiful brought you some encouragement and fun. If you like this video, subscribe, like, or leave a comment. If you'd like to see more of my illustration work, check out my website here. It contains work created with traditional materials, like we use today, and some created digitally. Thanks again, and I hope to see you soon. Aloha!